I want to welcome you to our second day of Adam Smith Week. I'm Professor Peter Calcano. I'm the Director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process here at the College of Charleston, the School of Business. Adam Smith Week is one of our signature events in the School of Business, and so I'm glad to see you all here. Before I get too far into it, I do want to make sure that I have a couple of shout-outs here that I want to do. I want to thank Dr. Jody Lipford for bringing down the students from Francis Marion today. Glad to have all of them here today. And I want to thank Liberty Fund as one of our sponsors of the events, who provided them with swag from Liberty Fund, including a copy of The Wealth of Nations. So big shout out to Liberty Fund as one of our sponsors for this week. The Center for the Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. And we do this through a lot of programming here on campus, mostly student programming. We have faculty research as well, but we do reading groups. We have speaker series throughout the year, of course, our Adam Smith Week, and we collaborate across various colleges and universities to bring students together in the region to discuss ideas of classical liberalism and thinkers such as Smith, Hayek, Buchanan. One of our major programs, of course, is our Market Process Scholars and our Public Choice Associates programs. These are our mentoring programs. I would encourage you, if you've been interested in what the Center's been doing this week and you've been interested in what you've been seeing, to think about applying. Our applications are open until March 30th. This is a program that we think is the centerpiece of what goes on. It's a multi-year program of mentoring our students. With that in mind, I want to bring forward one of our Market Process Scholars, Autumn Burkett, to introduce our speaker for this afternoon.
Hi, everybody. It is my honor to introduce one of today's guest speakers, Romina Boccia. She studied at George Mason, where she got her bachelor's and master's in economics. She is a fiscal economist, and she's the director of budget and entitlement policy at the Cato Institute. She has over a decade's experience researching and analyzing issues related to federal budgeting, government debt, and entitlement programs. She's also testified before Congress and helped inform policy discussions at the highest levels. Beyond this, she is also a nonprofit board member and founder of Conversate.io, where she brings people together to have meaningful conversations and share new ideas. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Romina Boccia.
Thank you so much, Autumn. How do I get to my slides, Peter? Oh, thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Romina Boccia. I'm the Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute. We are a libertarian think tank based in Washington, D.C., and I primarily work with Congress and the executive on trying to fix our debt crisis. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about what's driving the U.S. debt crisis? How far along are we? What are the implications of high and rising U.S. government debt, not just for the federal budget, but for your lives, for my life, for the lives of your children and grandchildren? And then what are some of the options that we have for fixing this problem, and what are some of the likely scenarios that we might encounter if Congress refuses to take action before a crisis forces their hands? Because if something can't go on forever, it will eventually stop. One of the tools I use to communicate with Congress and trying to nudge, prod, and sometimes coerce them into doing the right thing is that I have a Substack called the Debt Dispatch. It's free if you want to sign up. It's written in a way that makes our budget issues and fiscal developments and academic research as it's emerging on those issues accessible at a fourth or fifth grade reading level, because I am talking with members of Congress and their staff, not economists, so it's really important that I speak to them in the language that they can understand. So I encourage you all, if you want to stay on top of these issues, to sign up for my Substack, the Debt Dispatch. Let's dive right in. So, United States government debt here is depicted as a share of GDP. This is only our publicly held debt, the debt that the government has borrowed from credit markets. This does not include debts that we supposedly owe to the fictional Medicare and Social Security trust funds, and it also doesn't include our unfunded obligations, meaning promises that Congress has made to current seniors and other recipients of government benefits and government contracts that are in law at the moment. So if we did this on a forward-looking accounting basis, the figures here would be even worse. But what I want to show you with this graphic is that we are currently at a level that is as high as we last saw immediately following the end of World War II. Our debt is about as large as the size of the US economy right now at 99% of GDP, and is projected to exceed the record high ever in US history that we experienced immediately after World War II, with debt rising to 107% of GDP next year. And as you can see, debt is projected to grow significantly from there under current projections. I must say that these projections do not take into account the United States starting a war in the Middle East. So they're already outdated. They don't take into account any other fiscal shocks, economic crises, or public health crises like the pandemic that we encountered. So this is the best case scenario. Very obviously, it is not sustainable. Something else that is noteworthy about this chart is that you can see that the United States debt declined after World War II because these were wartime debts. The United States was responding to a war shock, spending a lot of money to fight World War II, and once that war ended, the United States cut down on defense spending. We had an economic boom, in part also as a result of women entering the labor force in large numbers at that time. So we had significant growth in labor force participation, some surpluses because Congress still believed in the old-time fiscal religion that we should be living on roughly balanced budgets unless we're at war. All of those things have changed. And today's rising debt is not a result of wartime spending, but rather it's a result of unsustainable promises that Congress has made, especially to seniors, defined as individuals 65 and older, that are being funded on the backs of younger generations in the form of borrowing. And these are primarily electoral promises. And these benefits are not based on need, but rather on the power of that particular political constituency. The individuals 65 and older are much more active when it comes to voting, much more active when it comes to calling their members of Congress and making their needs heard. And they also have the financial resources to support politicians when they're running for office. And the budget reflects their political strength in the numbers. And Adam Smith talked more about the propensity of governments to incur debts during times of war, because if you end up in a war, you have to basically raise a lot of money very quickly. And you can raise taxes to do so, but you may be shooting yourself in the foot at that time, because as you are ramping up wartime production, if you're also taxing the productive sector of your economy, you're reducing your ability to raise enough revenue to fund your war, and you're also undermining your productive economy at exactly the time where you need it to make up for the crowding out from the wartime effort. And so sovereigns have had a propensity to borrow in times of war, and that was something that was considered more normal. Still problematic, as Adam Smith talked about, the fiscal illusion embedded in borrowing during war times, that if the current taxpayers do not feel the pain, the full cost of the war, they're more likely to tolerate the war for longer. They're more likely to tolerate more wars than they otherwise would. So whenever governments do things by borrowing money rather than imposing the cost of whatever the activity is, whether it's a war, entitlement spending, on current constituencies through taxes, you are undermining the cost-benefit analysis that taxpayers otherwise might do, and you likely end up with more wars, longer wars, costlier wars, or in today's scenario, bigger entitlements that are more expensive than you would have if the current constituency was actually asked to pay for them. I also like in this quote by Adam Smith, and that he talks about embarrassment. The facility of borrowing delivers them from the embarrassment which this fear and inability would otherwise occasion. This is something I experience a lot when I work with members of Congress and I'm trying to tell them that we need to reform the entitlements. They feel very embarrassed in front of their constituents, so they rather have their heads stuck in the sand and pretend like everything is okay. So the debt chart I showed you as a percentage of GDP, I thought it might be useful to break it down into terms of a family budget. So what we did here is looking at the median US household income, which the median US household before taxes earns about $83,000 a year. If that median American household spent like the federal government does, earning $83,000 a year, they'd be spending more than $112,000 annually. So they're living beyond their means. And the difference there is about $28,000. That's how much they spend in addition to what they earn, and putting that straight onto their credit card, which at this time would have an interest payment of about $15,000 annually, translated into the US budget is about $1 trillion, and they'd be more than $600,000 in debt, which would maybe be okay if that was a mortgage, because then you would actually have an asset as collateral that you could sell, but in the case of this example is basically credit card debt. And Adam Smith was referring to the division of labor when he talked about what's prudent in the conduct of a private family can scarce be folly and that of a great kingdom. A lot of pundits don't like this comparison with the US federal budget to a family budget. The one time that I actually got Krugman's attention was when I put a chart like this out at a time when I was working at the Heritage Foundation, and he dedicated an entire column to how it was not appropriate to compare the US federal budget to a family budget, and that's when I knew I'd struck a nerve. Because when you talk about the federal budget in these abstract terms as a share of GDP or in trillions of dollars, people can often lose the real magnitude of what we're talking about, and that's why I think the comparison to a family budget can be so useful. The other aspect is Krugman and others like to say, well, but a family can't just print its own money, and the US federal government can. Yes, that is true, but that doesn't make it prudent for the government to rely on money printing in order to finance its expenditures, because doing so will ultimately result in higher inflation. Inflation, which drives up the prices of everything that we buy, which reduces the value of every dollar in your bank account or in your wallet, and which acts as a hidden tax that also is highly economically inefficient, because we rely on prices to determine what to produce and how much, and where there are profit opportunities where we can best serve our fellow neighbors in a way that also makes us better off. And when the government relies on inflation in order to finance its spending, it distorts all of those prices. And that creates inefficiencies in the economy and deadweight losses that make us all poorer and worse off. So if the government wants to spend, it should tax, and it should do so directly and visibly and transparently, and not through hidden channels like inflation. So what's driving the debt? Well, it's primarily a spending problem because our revenues, what the government collects in taxes, have been relatively stable, hovering between 17 to 20% as a share of GDP. And there's a much stronger correlation with the strength of the economy and what the government is able to collect in taxes than the different tax rates that the government imposes. Because sometimes when the government raises the tax rate, it can actually end up collecting less in revenue rather than more, because there are behavioral effects. When the taxes are too high, people work less, they invest less, they become more creative with hiding their income and assets, such that the government may not be able to increase tax revenue by increasing tax rates. So that's something to keep in mind. The higher line of 18.8% assumed that the Trump tax cuts, which were extended last July, would be allowed to expire. That didn't happen, so now we're on the lower trajectory of 17.3%. But even if the Trump tax cuts had been allowed to expire, we still would be nowhere near close to balancing the budget. In fact, the US government is running wartime deficit levels of about 6 to 7% of GDP at a time of relative peace and prosperity. And doing so over the long term is highly unsustainable, because it means that the government consumes more and more of our economic product, gobbling up more and more of our productive resources and crowding out spending and investments in the private sector. And all of this deficit spending, the gap between the orange line, which is spending, and the blue line, which is revenues, also incurs interest costs and further inflates the US national debt. Fun fact, I got to testify before the House Budget Committee, and they asked some of the Democratic witnesses that if they were able to institute all of their desired tax increases on the so-called wealthy, how much more revenue they thought that they could maximally raise given our current tax system. And even the Democrats admitted that probably no more than 20% reliably as a percentage of GDP. So if politicians were honest, both Democrats and Republicans would concede that we need to slow the growth in spending, or we would have to adopt an entirely new layer of taxation, taxing income that is taxing dollars that are not currently taxed, double taxing many individuals by, for example, adding a consumption tax or a value-added tax, which is how European countries finance their expensive welfare states. And if you look at the OECD and a comparison of social spending among OECD countries and compare it to the United States is actually very high up, similar to many European welfare states in terms of how much we're spending. It's just that the United States at this time doesn't tax the amount necessary to finance that European-sized welfare state, but we will pay for it one way or the other. And if we don't slow the growth in spending, we will have to raise taxes, primarily on lower and middle income earners, as they do in Europe, through, say, a consumption tax or a value-added tax, because there isn't enough money on the very top end of the income distribution to finance all of the spending that the federal government has put on the books. But you also have to know that if we rely on higher taxes to deal with this problem, that means that we make individuals even more dependent on the government. And that means fewer options for people to realize their own version of the American dream, to invest in their futures, to build businesses, to buy homes, to grow their families. So there's always a trade-off. It's not just about dollars and cents, but about the real limits to your opportunities and the choices that you have. We should also be careful that pretty much every time the government is able to find a new source of revenue, that won't necessarily make the fiscal challenge any smaller, because it's very possible that the government will decide to just spend that additional money too and try to max out the federal credit card as well. As Adam Smith highlighted in his book, There's No Art Which One Government Sooner Learns of Another Than That of Draining Money from the Pockets of the People. The really important thing is that we restrain the growth in government and we adopt institutional guardrails that prevent government from overspending and putting us into debt. That's the only sustainable way to avoid ever-growing government spending, consuming more and more of our wealth and prosperity. And just to reiterate the point that there isn't enough money at the very top end, the United States actually already has a highly progressive tax code where the top 10% of income earners, which is the upper block, everyone that's sort of orangey before we go into blue, those are your top 10% of income earners. This is the amount of income that they earn, is the share of their income. And they pay, on the bottom you can see a lot more of, as a proportion of their share of income, they pay 70% of all income taxes. So we're already taxing wealthier people heavily. I want to just say that one more time. The top 10% of income earners pay 70% of all income taxes. And so if you want to raise taxes, it will have to come from lower and middle income taxpayers. What's fueling all this growth in government spending? Where is all this money going? If we wanted to actually cut government spending, what would we need to target to make that work? What you're seeing here is a breakdown of the US federal budget as a percentage of GDP by major budget category. And let's start at the bottom, discretionary. That's the amount of money that the government votes on annually. That's your military, defense operations, grants for education, environmental protection, keeping the lights on in Congress. That's so-called discretionary spending, which is a misleading term. It doesn't mean that we don't need to spend that money. Arguably, defense is more of a core constitutional function of the government than, say, Social Security. But that's just how Congress has decided to label it. Everything else you see above that bottom blue layer, Congress doesn't vote on. They've set a lot of these programs into motion to grow automatically with no congressional review, no forcing mechanism to actually review these programs. And those, as you can see, are the key drivers of spending growth. And the biggest problems are the healthcare programs. If you add them up, we spend almost $2 trillion annually out of the $7 trillion annual federal budget on healthcare programs. Medicare is the biggest one, but Medicaid is not far behind and growing rapidly. And then it's Social Security, which is the government's retirement program. And we've been told a convenient story that especially Medicare and Social Security are funded by dedicated payroll taxes. That is mostly true for Social Security, but is absolutely untrue for Medicare, which only Medicare Part A, the smallest component of Medicare, the so-called Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, is actually paid for by payroll taxes. Everything else is funded by income taxes, other taxes, so-called general revenues, and mostly federal government borrowing. And so one of the problems we have with reforming Medicare and Social Security, which are some of the largest programs and the biggest drivers of our debt because they are growing the fastest, as you can see, they're expanding as a share of the economy, is that people don't necessarily see them as government welfare programs, but they see them as earned benefits. Even though if you look under the hood of how these actually work, that is absolutely not true. Current taxpayers, younger working Americans, pay the payroll taxes that go immediately out the door to fund Social Security and Medicare benefits. There's no savings. The trust funds don't exist in any real economic sense. They're intergovernmental accounting mechanisms. They're basically fictional accounts that record IOUs between the Treasury Department, which collects and spends all the money, and the Social Security Administration, which administers the Social Security program and its benefits. But all of the money that Congress collected in payroll taxes, even during times when we had payroll tax surpluses, primarily in Social Security from 1983 to 2010, Congress immediately spent on other government needs, priorities, wants, activities, without actually doing any real saving to be able to pay those benefits today, such that Social Security, which is supposed to be fully funded by payroll taxes, this year alone will add $250 billion to our deficit, or to the overall federal debt, because it's already running a cash flow deficit. And just to illustrate that point again, I'm skipping over this long quote, it's the major entitlements that are gobbling up most of the budget. If you look at it as a share of non-interest spending, it's the major entitlements that are gobbling up more and more of the budget. And that doesn't mean that other components are shrinking. Rather, they are declining as a share of total spending, but overall the federal budget is growing across the board. There's one category we haven't talked about yet, and that's interest on the debt. And interest on the debt has become one of the key drivers, in fact, the largest and fastest growing driver of US government debt in recent years. After the pandemic, when we had the inflation of 2022, 9% annual inflation, a record high we hadn't seen in 40 years, interest rates also went up. And when before the pandemic, we spent about $300 billion annually on interest on the debt. Now we're spending $1 trillion annually on interest on the debt, which is more than we spend on national defense. Although President Trump is keen on changing that by, instead of reducing what we spend on interest on the debt, now increasing what we spend on defense. This is obviously the wrong approach, because we're already borrowing about $2 trillion annually because of that gap between revenues and spending. And if we borrow even more, that means the debt goes up. That means we pay more interest on the debt, because when your debt goes up, everything else equal, meaning your interest rates stay the same, you pay more interest on the debt. Worse, though, when your debt is as high as it is for the United States government right now, it actually pushes up interest rates, assuming the Federal Reserve doesn't decide to cut them and instead allow for higher inflation. So there's always, a wiggle room here if the government would rather rely on inflation. But interest on the debt is growing significantly. And one of the major problems with interest on the debt is that it doesn't buy you anything. It is just a transfer from current taxpayers to US government bondholders. And worse than that, as we pay more on interest on the debt, we end up in a debt spiral where the government has to borrow more money just to pay the interest on the existing debt, which pushes up interest rates on the debt, which then necessitates even more borrowing, again, to pay the interest on the debt. You end up in this vicious cycle where your borrowing begets more borrowing in order to pay for your borrowing. And that's where we find ourselves now, such that over the next 10 years, by 2036, the major entitlements and interest on the debt will consume all federal tax revenues. That means there won't be any money left for keeping the lights on in Congress, for paying our troops, our national defense, or anything else you think the government should or should not be doing, but they are currently obligated to do because it's in law. So we would need to borrow every single penny that we spend on national defense if we don't reform the entitlement programs and reduce our debt such that we can also reduce our interest payments. One thing that could also help bring down interest rates and reduce interest payments is if the federal government adopted a credible mechanism, a credible target, say a 3% of GDP deficit target, which will be discussed in Congress this Thursday, or a target to stabilize the debt. at no more than 100% of GDP and stop it from growing ever higher, or a balanced budget requirement. Any of those would work really well for signaling to credit markets that we will not resort to inflation, which is what looks very likely every day that we don't fix this problem, but we will honor our obligations and we will not inflate away the value of our debt and thereby default on US bondholders, because that is one form of default. If we got Congress to adopt a credible mechanism, a credible target, and bondholders actually believed that the United States government was serious about getting its fiscal house in order, about fixing the debt problem before it results in a major fiscal crisis, that could bring down interest rates, because part of the interest rate is the premium that our bondholders demand based on the inflation that they expect in the future. So that's one way that debt could be addressed. And sometimes people will claim that we don't need to worry about the debt because, yes, it's debt on one side of the ledger to the US federal government, but it's an asset. It creates wealth on the other side of the ledger. But Adam Smith had that insight going back 250 years ago, that is not how it works. That is reasoning from an accounting identity. But when the government incurs debt, it's because it's spending real resources and diverting them away from productive uses in the economy, especially when the government is borrowing in order to fund a war, which results in destruction, or borrowing in order to fund transfers, which primarily support consumption rather than investment and productive activities. So when the government borrows, it doesn't create wealth. It redistributes resources, especially from younger and future generations to the present. And in the process, creates fiscal illusion because current taxpayers don't feel the full cost of the government that they receive, enjoy, suffer under, and so they tolerate a larger government that grows faster than they otherwise would. I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to skip forward a little bit. I want to leave you also with this Adam Smith quote, because this is what we can look forward to if we don't get Congress to fix the debt by reforming the entitlement programs, which is that, as Adam Smith observed, even going back 250 years ago, if we can't get government spending under control, they will debase the currency. As he talks about, the raising of the denomination of the coin has been the most usual expedient by which a real public bankruptcy has been disguised under the appearance of a pretended payment. This is how governments end up dealing with their debt. If they don't cut their spending and they don't raise taxes to pay for government spending, they end up debasing the currency, they end up generating inflation, thereby devaluing the value of the debt, the nominal value of the debt, basically defaulting on bondholders. And in the process, generating inflation that we will all suffer under, because inflation is ultimately a form of tax. It's just a hidden tax. That's a tax on all the dollars in your pockets, on the value of your bank accounts. So that's what we're trying to avoid. Because the US government issues its own currency, it has the option of generating as many dollars as it needs to spend, but it comes with the cost of that generating inflation. So if we want to avoid inflation, how do we fix the problem? We can grow the economy. That's a great option because nobody loses, everybody wins. A stronger economy brings in more revenue, win-win solution. We could eliminate a lot of the bad loopholes in the tax code. That's also a great solution. We might even be able to reduce tax rates, reducing distortions, allowing for more investment, people working more because they can keep more of their own money. If we eliminate a lot of these special tax preferences that are littering our tax code, and we could even end up with a simpler tax code as a result. The less costly it is for the government to raise revenue, the more of the revenue it raises can actually go towards government spending. And then, we could raise taxes. We could institute a carbon tax, a value-added tax. I don't endorse these proposals. I don't actually think they would solve the problem, but they might delay the day of reckoning if the government brought in more revenue. Ultimately, though, we need to drive down the growth in Medicare and Social Security, which are growing on autopilot without congressional review, because Congress adopted in law program requirements decades ago that allow these programs to gobble up more and more of our economic resources without Congress even having to vote on them. So we need to make Congress vote on what's currently autopilot entitlement spending and curb its growth. We don't even necessarily need to cut it in real terms. We just need to slow the growth in these programs so that they grow ideally more slowly than the economy rather than much, much faster. When I say much, much faster, Medicare actually over the past 50 years has grown at 1.5 times the rate of the economy. So as the economy grows, we spend even more on Medicare, so we also can't grow our way out of it. The biggest problems are in healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, and now Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. The best solution there is to get the government out of the business of providing healthcare. Instead, if the government wants to subsidize healthcare, we would be better off if it gave the Medicare and Medicaid subsidy directly to the individuals it's trying to benefit, and especially if those individuals could pocket the savings if they bought lower cost health plans, if they used fewer healthcare services. But the way that it's currently structured for someone on Medicare, for example, to get the full value of their Medicaid benefit, Medicare benefit, they actually have to consume healthcare services. And so we're driving up the cost of healthcare because we've designed these programs with the incentives all going in the direction of more spending rather than less. And with Social Security, the big issue is that we've promised benefits that are too generous, that are not affordable, and that are not paid for by the generations that are receiving them, but rather are a transfer from younger workers to older workers. So we should raise the eligibility age, the Social Security eligibility age of 65. At the time Social Security came into the world, that was actually life expectancy. 65 was life expectancy, and now it's like 78. But the Social Security retirement age has barely changed, and so we could raise that so that if people are living longer, they're also working longer. But we should also reduce the growth of benefits, especially for higher earners. My ideal version of Social Security provides a flat, predictable benefit that primarily keeps people out of poverty, say $2,000 a month, and otherwise allows everyone to save and invest for their own retirement as they see fit. Because retirement is something that you can plan for. It's unlike disability that can happen to you at any time. But becoming old, we should have enough foresight to do that. But, some people will be myopic, lazy, irresponsible, whatever. We can provide a backstop benefit that everyone can be eligible for that would be a lot less expensive than the current system. Congress likes to do welfare reform, not very aggressively, but there's some options there. Some of this was done in last year in the July bill. There's more talk of welfare reform now, but it won't fix the budget crisis. That doesn't mean it's a good thing. We could increase labor force participation if we reduce the generosity of welfare benefits, especially for able-bodied individuals that should be working and not be collecting a welfare check. And then discretionary spending limits is basically putting a limit on how much the government can spend on defense or grants for transportation, environmental protection, you name it. So those are some of the solutions we have. How do we get them adopted? Because it's not that we don't know what to do, it's that we don't know how to get the job done. That's recognizing that the economically necessary policy choices that we need to make are politically extremely unpopular. And that means reducing the benefits in Social Security and Medicare primarily. And so how can we get that done? Congress has tried commissions. That means you basically get members from both parties in a room and you make them hash out a plan to fix the problem. In many cases, those have failed because members of Congress would still need to vote on the proposal. But there is an example of a successful fiscal commission in the US historical context, and that was the BRAC, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, which succeeded at closing obsolete military bases after World War II, after the Cold War, something that Congress found politically difficult to do, and the way that they managed to do it is by empowering an independent expert commission, basically creating a scapegoat for Congress to say, well, we wouldn't close any of these military bases, but it's these experts, they did it, blame them. And I say, blame me, Congress, let's go, I'm ready. And then locking in, if we could get on a path to balance, locking in that balance, we should look at mechanisms like a debt break or a balanced budget requirement added to the Constitution so that Congress cannot spend beyond our means by borrowing from the future, by indebting younger generations that don't have a voice in that process, by draining opportunity from future taxpayers, which is how we're currently financing so much of our government spending. And then Congress has tried spending caps, but those are very easily circumvented. And so there's many examples of spending caps that Congress has adopted, i.e. the penny plan is Senator Rand Paul's proposal to basically flatline the federal budget and reduce it by 1%. It's not that I'm opposed to the target, it's just that if it's not part of the Constitution, it's just too easy for Congress to waive. They do love to waive the guardrails they put in place. So we need stronger guardrails. We need a mechanism to get to balance. Best is probably a BRAC-style independent fiscal commission, a mechanism to lock in balance, a real fiscal guardrail, a constitutional balanced budget amendment, maybe modeled after the Swiss or German debt break, which is counter-cyclical. You don't have to balance every single year, but you can balance over a business cycle that allows you to borrow during times of war and economic crisis, and then repay that borrowing when you have economically strong times, basically Keynesian economics, but I'll take it. Anything but the unsustainable debt growth we have right now, and that's how you can get there. And I think that we need to have an honest conversation in our country about the programs that are driving the growth in the debt, what their purpose is, and whether the social contract that we're currently living under is at all fair. So one idea that Buchanan has written about, and then Rawls is more famous for, with some differences between the two of them, is that if you were behind the so-called veil of ignorance and you didn't know if you were a senior or a younger worker in this scenario, would you agree to the system that we have? Would you agree to the way that the current budget basically rewards older generations by draining the pocketbooks of younger generations the way it's structured? And if you look at the federal budget, by the end of 2029, 50 cents of every federal dollar that we will spend will go towards benefits for the individuals 65 and older. 50 cents of every dollar the federal government spends will go towards individuals 65 and older. They make up about 17% of the population, and they are the wealthiest generation in world history. So we are transferring the most resources to the people who need them the least. And then we wonder why we have a fertility crisis. I think that there's a fairer social contract if we're honest with constituents. And I believe fundamentally that the older generation wants to leave the country in a way that they don't leave the next generation worse off. If they understood how Medicare and Social Security are actually funded, and if we could get together and perhaps empower an independent fiscal commission to restructure our current system so it's fairer, so it doesn't just automatically, almost like in sleepwalking mode, transfer more and more resources from younger to older generations, I think we could strike a more just social contract that would allow our economy to grow, create opportunities for younger working families, while still honoring the promise to the older generation that they be able to retire with in dignity. I want to open the floor to questions now, and also remind you that you can subscribe to the Debt Dispatch on Substack. And I have a new book out, Reimagining Social Security, if you're interested in that. Happy to send a copy or talk to you more about that. Thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Have one. If not, I'll
start it off. I may have missed this because I did come in late, but going back to that model that you showed with the percentages since 1963 of what percentage I think GDP is government expenditures, what's the ideal percentage in your eyes? I mean, like,
Yes.
What should we kind of aim for in that?
So that is a value judgment. And I personally, as a libertarian, would like the government to do, especially the federal government, to focus on very few limited activities, primarily national defense, and leave most other activities to the state and local governments, where we can have more competition in a true federalist system where Americans can choose whether they want to live under a more expensive government that provides more social services and other services, or they could move easily to a state that has lower expenditures and where individuals are more reliant on themselves, their communities and families to provide for themselves. When you centralize so much decision making at the federal level, you rob Americans of that choice and you limit the competition we would otherwise observe in a more federalist system. But in terms of what is sustainable, if historically under a current tax system, not that I think that we shouldn't be taxing people less, but we've been able to raise 17 to 19% of GDP, so let's call it in the middle 18% of GDP. Ideally, we would roughly have a balanced budget, which occasionally might be a little higher, the spending, than the revenues, but then during other times should be lower so that it averages out to balance, because then at least we're making sure that current constituents who are receiving the government services that are that they're being taxed for are roughly internalizing the cost of the government. Because what we're doing right now is we're giving current constituents the government at a steep discount. And what do you do when things are for sale at a discount? You buy more of them. And that's what we're seeing, is that I think we have a bigger government that most Americans would otherwise tolerate if at least they had to pay for the government that they receive. So there's an early retirement penalty right now. You can retire as early as 62 or claim benefits, basically. And then there's a delayed retirement credit. If you wait until 70, you can max out your benefit. And the rough return on waiting is 8% in real terms, inflation adjusted, relatively risk-free, assuming you believe that the federal government will honor that promise. In terms of will you receive more in benefits than you paid in taxes, it entirely depends on your income. Because the Social Security system is highly progressive or redistributive, where lower income earners receive a much higher replacement rate. And if they live a long life, can collect more in benefits than they paid in taxes. Higher income earners tend to pay more in taxes after accounting for interest, than they will receive in benefits. However, it again depends on their longevity. If they wait until 70 and then live to 85 or longer, they'll be able to collect more in benefits than they paid in taxes. With Medicare, the math is much more lopsided because so little of Medicare is funded by payroll taxes. So yeah, the idea is to encourage people to delay retirement, because you don't have to just factor in the amount you pay in payroll taxes, but the government also benefits from your other income taxes and sales taxes, et cetera, that you will be paying while you're still working and consuming more. You want to pick?
The federal government even admitted this week that they're insolvent. Would you explain to these students what insolvency means?
I think it's hard to explain in the context of the federal government, because so long as the amount of unfunded obligation doesn't exceed the total wealth in the economy, you could argue that they could just confiscate it from the American people, right? They're insolvent in the sense that the amount that they've promised to spend is far in excess of what they are projected to collect in revenues, but they could raise taxes, they could confiscate wealth, and they can do so by printing more dollars, which they have full control of the dollar printing presses. So I have seen that article you're referring to.
Well, this didn't include unfunded liabilities. This is strictly funded liabilities, assets, $8 or $10 trillion, liabilities at that 45 trillion. By any imagination, in any company, in any individual, you are by definition insolvent. And like I say, the government actually this week, I'll try to get you that article.
I've seen that article.
I've been saying it for a long time. They finally listened to me.
Yeah, our fiscal situation is highly unsustainable. We should fix it.
I wanted to ask, at what point does a program like Social Security shift from being reformable to, I guess, needing restructuring? And like, how do you decide when that point is?
I think that we should have restructured, or I like to say reimagined because it sounds more positive, Social Security a long, long time ago. The way that it was put in place, I don't think ever made sense. Now, it was perhaps more justifiable back in the 1930s than it is today, but in today's environment where it's so easy for individuals to save for their own retirement, they don't have to even use financial advisors. There's accounts that will auto-enroll them, that will automatically invest their contributions in a target date index funds where it's completely automated and you don't have to ever think about it, where it's so much easier for people to prepare for their own retirement than has ever been the case before. It is a real loss in terms of the wealth that people could gain if they weren't so heavily taxed and instead were able to keep their own money and save and invest it as they see fit. I think that we should start from the question of what should Social Security do if we're going to have it. I think the only morally justifiable thing is that we prevent poverty. But to do income transfers, regardless of need, is neither affordable nor prudent. Especially when we're so deeply in debt. And so I think we should redesign or reimagine the program in thinking about how can we meet that goal of poverty prevention without undermining the future of the next generation. And we can do that by slowing the growth for wealthier individuals in their benefits, adjusting the benefit formula so they receive a smaller benefit. Some people like means testing, which would potentially cut off certain people from receiving any benefit. I'm not generally opposed to it, but it does come with some disincentives for people to save and invest, and it will incentivize people to find ways to hide their money, transfer it to their children early, all of that. So it's not necessary that we means test things so long as the benefit that we do provide is small enough where it's large enough that it protects lower income workers who maybe didn't have the opportunity to save because they never earned enough and they always needed to spend it all, without undermining capital accumulation and savings among middle class and higher income individuals who could and would save more in the absence of the government taking so much of their money and then transferring such large sums. A lot of people don't realize how generous Social Security is. A dual earner high income couple can collect more than $112,000 annually from Social Security. Add to that the value of their Medicare benefit and other government benefits that they receive, and millionaires can collect roughly the equivalent value of about $150,000 annually as a couple from the government, which is just a completely absurd transfer from my perspective.
Do we still have the cap on the taxes? So it's only the first so many?
Yes.
100, would that make any difference, is getting rid of that cap?
So the current cap is at $188,000, which is relatively high in an international comparison, but the benefits that higher income earners receive are also capped based on that amount. So if you're eliminating the payroll tax cap, the question you have to answer is, do I credit higher income earners with the additional benefits? And now you could potentially pay benefits in excess of $200,000 annually to an individual. Or do I just confiscate more money from wealthier individuals and not give them any higher benefits? Now you've fundamentally changed the nature of the program, right? It becomes even more of a welfare program. In which case, should we even be paying such high benefits to such high income earners? Because there's obviously a trade-off. If we actually eliminated the payroll tax cap, which I don't think is politically feasible for either party, you would significantly distort incentives to work and invest. If you look at the people who'd be most affected by the huge marginal tax increase, 12.4% on top of your current taxes. People who live in California and New York, once you add in their state and local taxes, their tax rates would exceed 60%. And so they're going to work less, they're going to invest less, they might move. And so that's one reason that neither Democrats or Republicans, I think, can really do this. And a lot of the people who'd be affected would be doctors. And then you have to consider, like, a lot of the doctors are older. So they're going to face the decision, do I keep working and keep less of my money, or maybe I'll just retire and start claiming Social Security and Medicare. And so it has all these adverse consequences. Other people who'd be affected that Republicans wouldn't like to hit with this tax increase will be small businesses, family farms. So it's, people who use the LLC and the pass-through system to do business operations that would be affected by that massive tax increase. And then even if you did all that and you could appease all these groups and you raised additional taxes, under current projections, you would get about 5 years of surpluses. And unless you lock them away, which we didn't do with the other surpluses, Congress would spend them on other things. You could actually fuel the growth in government like we did. I believe that the Social Security surpluses allowed for the Bush tax cuts and allowed for the expansion of Medicare Part D. And now we're in even worse shape than we would have been otherwise. And so we would have to find a way to lock those surpluses away to make sure that they actually go towards Social Security. But that solution alone wouldn't be a sustainable solution either. It would buy you some time, but you would also have to make other changes.
Time for maybe, Jody, I'll give you the last question.
So early on you said, for the first time, can't go on forever, it'll stop. You repeatedly referred to the budget and that deficit as unsustainable. Do you have any thoughts on why we have not seen a very strong response from the bond market?
So arguably, we've already suffered a debt crisis in 2022 when we had 9% inflation as a result of the government spending $6 trillion in emergency stimulus spending during the COVID pandemic, and the Federal Reserve monetizing $3 trillion of that by adding it to the balance sheet. And that created all of that inflation. And that arguably was a debt crisis. Interest rates are much higher now than they were before the pandemic. We're spending $1 trillion on interest on the debt. That is an interest crisis. We're spending more on interest on the debt than on defense. So arguably, we already have a version of a fiscal crisis. In the meantime, because the debt is so high and it's pushed up interest costs, it's crowding out private sector investment. People are holding off on buying homes. People aren't moving. That's reducing labor mobility. All of that is depressing economic growth. Startups and businesses that are trying to do exciting new innovative ventures are less able to get capital to do so. We'll pay for that down the road because those are inventions that won't come online. Those are improvements in our life expectancy and living standards that we won't get to enjoy. The problem, Jody, of course, is that these are opportunity costs and they're invisible.
I'm just thinking like should be even higher.
Oh, they will be. Just give it a few more years.
I hate to end on that note. But I'd like y'all to give one more round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.